This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and today we're going to be talking with Kshama Sawant. She's a former socialist city council person in the Seattle City Council, and she is now running in a campaign against Adam Smith for a congressional seat in Washington, the state of Washington. So welcome to our show, Kshama.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So Kshama, the recent couple of days has been there's been an attack by the United States on Iran, which is leading to massive destruction and a regional war. Why don't we talk about this war, what caused it, and what it means for, first of all, the working class in Iran and the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the war is not going to be good for working and poor and oppressed people anywhere. Obviously, starting with the people in Iran who are directly facing death and destruction. We heard numbers that already 1,000 have been killed. And at the same time, we have seen Israeli airstrikes not only being limited to Iran, but also targeting other nations in the region like Lebanon. And so we're seeing, for example, hundreds being killed in these other parts of the region as well. And over 65,000 people in Lebanon being forced to flee their homes because of the airstrikes. And as far as working class people in the United States are concerned, let's look at the amount of money that is going to be spent on this war, and this is part of the agenda of forever war of US capitalism and imperialism. And so you contrast the 900 plus trillion, sorry, 900 plus billion dollars, which is almost $1 trillion, which I was about to say, that the US Congress approved in December of last year, so just 2.5 months ago, for new war spending. And so that's where this money is coming from. And so it is absolutely dishonest. It's complete lies for Democrats like my opponent, Adam Smith, who has been a general among the warmongers, for them to pretend that they were against this war when really the financing of this war is coming from the National Defense Authorization Act that they voted for in December. And so all of this is also means that it's 900 plus billion dollars that are not available for the immediate needs of the working class and poor people in the United States. So at the same time that we are seeing unprecedented cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and social assistance, $1 trillion, though where are those $1 trillion going? They're going for weapons manufacturing and military intelligence, and the people who are profiting from it are obviously the weapons manufacturing billionaires. And let's keep in mind that the billionaires who benefit from weapons manufacturing, war intelligence, and the forever war agenda of US imperialism are not just the Palantirs and the Lockheed Martins. Of course, they are the most direct beneficiaries. They're, Lockheed Martins, for example, stocks have gone up. But it's not only them, it's the billionaire class as a whole, because the billionaires and multimillionaires together own stocks of all the corporations, top corporations put together. So in reality, it is really divided by class. And this is the epitome of capitalism. It is divided by class. So the ruling class, the billionaires and multimillionaires, are the ones who benefit. And who loses from war? It is working class people everywhere. That is why we need international working class solidarity against war and imperialism.
And of course, the United States in the post-war period has been in major wars: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. Trillions and trillions of dollars have been spent on imperialist war. Why is imperialist war part and parcel of capitalism?
One dimension of understanding why war is inevitable is because there is competition among and tussle for ownership of resources of the world among within the billionaire class. I mean, the billionaire class is international, and capitalism, it's a global system that is divided into nation states. And so there are capitalist states, that are associated with the nation states. For example, the US is a nation state which has its own capitalist government, but that government unlike what we are taught in our conventional history books, does not our civics books does not actually look out for the population as a whole or the working class or the most vulnerable people. It's the exact opposite. It is the state, the existence of the capitalist state in every nation under capitalism is meant to look out primarily for the interests of the capitalist class of that nation state. And so given that the overall domination of the capitalist system is divided up into these various sections of the billionaires, there it becomes inevitable. It's in the logic of the system, of the capitalist system, that there will be war by one means or another, either through the means of politics and through economic strategy and economic competition, or through, as we're seeing right now, through hot wars. But I think that picture remains grossly incomplete unless you put in place also the most fundamental, the most crucial aspect of capitalism, which is that the capitalist class has to uh, uh, has to invent means of subjugation of the mass of the people who otherwise are living in conditions that will incite them into revolt against a deeply unjust system. So the Middle East, in fact, is a prime example of what I'm talking about, which is that it's a very resource rich region. I mean, it is home to some of the most crucial resources that fuel the system of capitalism, namely fossil fuels and oil. And so, for over a century, it has been the need of, for example, to begin with, of Western capitalism to carry out wars in the region in order to keep the working class in check, especially to keep at bay the potential of a regional working class based revolt, working class based resistance, trade union strike actions against the domination of the capitalist class. But Western capitalism is by far is not the only, I mean, is by far the most dominant force, but it's not the only force. The way that Western capitalism dominates the Middle East is also by making sure that there are ruling classes, in homegrown ruling classes. For example, the regime in Saudi Arabia, it's basically a totalitarian regime. It's a monarchy. But also the ruling classes in nations like Jordan, Oman, the UAE. These are all ruling classes that are in alliance with Western capitalism in order to keep the working class as a whole in check. And so having routine wars, routine aggression, military aggression in this region is embedded in the logic of capitalism. And that is also where the Israel Palestine issue stems from. It's not because working people decided that there was going to be some sort of ethnic based or religion based war, but it's actually based in the material logic of capitalism itself. And Israel is not something that exists on its own. Is the Israeli state is the principal garrison state that is looking out for the interests of US and Western capitalism there. And then, yeah, that is the only way to explain the 80 years of absolutely brutal domination, including just utter bloodshed against the Palestinian people, because that is the way that the ruling classes in the region and the ruling classes of the United States and Western Europe are able to dominate over the resources of that region. And so I think ultimately, if we are going to explain what is happening, it has to be based on this logic, and not only on Trump. Obviously, Trump himself is a warmonger. He is an absolute enemy of the working class in any nation, whether it is in Iran or in Palestine or in the United States. But we are not able to explain this, and it is extremely dishonest of what we see in the corporate media, the New York Times, and so on, where they make it only about Trump and his idiosyncrasies, but that is not actually true at all. It is the far, I mean, Trump obviously has his idiosyncrasies, but the far more dominant factor that explains what is happening is the fact that the United States is a capitalist nation, and it's the most powerful imperialist nation, and that this type of war and imperialism and forever war is embedded in the logic of the system, and that is why they are going to continue doing this.
And of course, the Democrats have funded the war. As you said, they voted for this $1 trillion military budget. They say they're against what's going on, or they're questioning the constitutionality of what's going on, but they've supported sanctions against Iran. They support sanctions against countries, Cuba. They're getting ready to invade, attack Cuba. Also, the question of China and isolating China, which is a competitor to United States. The United States can't compete economically with cars and other material. The United States now, in taking over Venezuela, are which provided 80% of its oil was going to China, is now cut off. The oil has to go through the United States. And of course, Iran provides large amounts of its oil. 15% of China's needs for oil are going from Iran. Isn't this aimed also at China and trying to weaken China and surround China?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I wanted to explain this also, and I'm glad you brought this up, that in order to understand the way war and military aggression is a perpetual process under capitalism, is also to understand the period that capitalism is in a given moment. I mean, if you look at the military aggression and the utter destruction, annihilation of society in a country like Afghanistan in the 70s, the whole period, 70s to the 90s and the early 2000s, that can be explained only by the fact of the US versus Soviet Union Cold War at the time. And now a lot of the logic of the war can only be explained through the lens of the US led bloc and the China led bloc, and the competition between those two blocks, which is again a reflection of the new crisis that global capitalism is in. And you're absolutely right that war is, as they say, war is politics by other means and politics is war by other means. I think there's a lot of truth to that, in the sense that, for example, when you mention sanctions, that is a very crucial component of explaining what is being done by US and Western imperialism against the working and poor people of nations like Iran and Venezuela, is that economic sanctions are not as my opponent Adam Smith wants to falsely present it, is diplomatic means of settling differences about nuclear weaponry and all of that. What economic sanctions are in reality is a punishing policy against working and poor people of that region. That is whom the sanctions land on. So if you look at the impact of sanctions on Venezuela, for example, the Lancet has a very important study. It's an economic study, but it's from the standpoint of the impact on healthcare of the working and poor people in the region. And one of the things they note is that, and they study the effect of sanctions in general around the world, which includes obviously Iran as well, because Iran has been the at the receiving end of some of the most brutal sanctions. What they note is that the impact of sanctions is so devastating that it's like, for example, in Venezuela, they note that its impact has been worse than, by proportion, than the impact of the Great Depression on the US working class. That's how devastating these economic sanctions are. If you look at the economic situation that the Iranian working and poor people have been subjected to for decades now, the inflation rate is at nearly 43%. Can you even imagine? I mean, the economy's backbone has been completely broken, and that is the crisis that lands on the masses of people, and that has also been at the root of a part of the root of the revolt against the Islamist regime. Obviously, the revolt also includes anger against the genuinely horrifically repressive practices and policies by the Islamist regime. And so, when you put all of this together, it is important to understand for us that the solution is not that we support the Islamist regime. No, absolutely not. It's a reactionary regime, and that it needs to go. But that is not going to happen through US imperialist war. It is only going to happen through a working class uprising, not just in Iran, but in the region. It needs to be a regional working class and revolutionary uprising. And the only way we can actually liberate the working class is to fight to end the sanctions and fight to end military aggression as well. And just to put a fine point on it in terms of, explaining that this is not only about Trump, this is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as both being parties of US capitalism and imperialism, is that let's not forget that the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust of the 21st century, started under Biden and the Democratic Party. And while Biden was in office, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, actually presented options to him for striking Iran's nuclear facilities. And so, in other words, as a Marxist, I mean, we have to be very clear. We're against nuclear weaponry being possessed by any nation, because it is absolutely, the impact of nuclear weapons is deeply destructive. Uh, and we are absolutely against all of that. But we have to note that the United States, under both the Democrats and Republicans, has beaten the drum of how they need to go after Iran for those nuclear facilities. And also, let's take note of the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the guy of main guy of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, he has been saying, I mean, there's videos of him being shown saying the same thing for 20 years, like, oh, it is imminent, like, in 2 weeks Iran is going to build nuclear weapons. In 2 weeks, you're seeing those videos of 2 week warnings for like 20 years. So all of this shows that this is the agenda of forever war is not about one president. It is about the agenda of the US imperialist class itself, which means that it's both Democrats and Republicans are absolutely at the head of it.
And the argument of China has been that they can build an alternative financial structure, BRICS, multipolarism, and that is a solution to the U.S. imperialist control of the world economy. What is this war with Iran going to do to their whole idea of multipolarism?
I mean, if you look at just the overall calculations of how powerful, the economically and militarily powerful, the Chinese regime is versus the United States, there's no doubt. I mean, that it has, compared to 30 years ago, the Chinese economy has made massive strides and actually put to the pale much of the industry in the United States. For example, they are now the leaders in AI, semiconductors, a lot of the areas of industry. But as far as working people are concerned, and that is why I think it's impossible to reach the correct conclusions unless we place an internationalist working class lens on how we analyze, because it is important to understand that the Chinese regime is also a capitalist regime. China is also controlled by the billionaire class. And the Chinese working class people have nothing to gain by supporting their homegrown capitalist class any more than US working class people have anything to gain by supporting US billionaires. And same thing with all the BRICS countries, India, Brazil, Russia, Ukraine. Working class people have far more in common with working class people in other nations than we do with the billionaires and multimillionaires of our own nations. And that is why we have to be crystal clear that China and Russia, the ruling classes of China and Russia are not an acceptable substitute for the United States. And we, as working class people, have nothing to gain through by trying to get into the competition between the US ruling class and the Chinese ruling class. We actually have to build our forces against ruling classes of the entire world. Our battle is against the capitalist system itself. And so we have to build international links on a working class basis against the ruling classes of all nations. And that includes the United States, all the nations of Western Europe, India, China, Russia, Iran, and so on.
And of course, Modi, who's part of BRICS, has just agreed to sign a trade agreement with Israel, propping up Israel. This
Oh,
is
yeah.
an
I mean,
example of.
yeah, no, sorry, not to interrupt you, Steve, but I mean, it's actually stunning the degree to which the Modi regime, the right-wing Hindu fundamentalist reactionary regime, is building links with the United States and Israeli capitalist classes. In fact, The India has become now either the main or one of the main buyers of Israeli weapons. They've just bought, tens of billions of dollars worth of Israeli weapons. So they are very much in cahoots with the ruling classes of the United States and Western Europe and Israel.
And the rise of social democracy in the United States, with election of Mondani in New York, his trying to work with Trump, socialists and fascists coming together. What is going on with the Mondani, and also this idea that you can work out agreements between making changes for the working class and with the Trump fascist government?
I think this is such a deeply, deeply deceptive and ultimately dangerous and fatal idea that working class people absolutely cannot have any faith in. This whole idea of what's been perpetuated by the Democratic Socialists of America and newspapers like the New York Times, where they're calling it Mamdani's charm offensive on Trump. These are deeply dangerous and destructive ideas that you can somehow charm a guy like Trump. And it's not just about Trump. The idea that Mamdani and AOC and all of these guys peddle is that you can charm your way into some substantial reforms for the working class, but that's not how it works. You don't actually win substantial reforms, substantial improvements. I mean, when I say reforms, I mean substantial improvements for the working class on the basis of trying to make deals with the ruling class. That is not how it works. It is no coincidence that it is actually my track record, our track record on the Seattle City Council, when I was on the Seattle City Council for a decade as a revolutionary socialist, unlike a social democrat that Mamdani is and AOC. It is no coincidence that it was my office as a revolutionary socialist city council office that was able to win unparalleled victories in our times, I mean, which is the nation's highest minimum wage, winning the Amazon tax, directly defeating a billionaire like Jeff Bezos to win hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes on the wealthiest corporations like Bezos's Amazon, to build affordable, publicly owned, affordable rent controlled housing in the city and winning unprecedented renters' rights. The reason we were able to win all these victories is because I was, and my fellow revolutionary socialists were, crystal clear that our task, when I got elected, I was clear that my task was not to go and administer the capitalist state, just being a little bit more benign than the Democrats on the city council. My task was to disrupt the capitalist state, disrupt business as usual, use my office to build mass movements of working class people, bring that power, that mass power, organized power to bear to force concessions. And that is the correct vocabulary we need to use. What the ruling classes don't give us nice things because they wake up one day and they feel kindly towards us. No, what we win in improvements of in our living standards, we rest as concession. These are hard-won victories when we force the ruling class by putting the fear of something worse, and from their standpoint, something worse. For example, we won the Amazon tax and the nation's highest minimum wage by collecting tens of thousands of signatures for a ballot initiative, making it very clear to the ruling class. We sent a credible threat message to the ruling class and to the Democratic Party that represents them that if you don't vote yes on our $15 minimum wage, which is now $21.30. If you don't vote on this, if you don't vote on our Amazon tax legislation, we are going to go take it directly to the voters. And you can see from the fact that we have collected, for example, for the Amazon tax, we collected 30,000 signatures, that it is a credible threat, that we have enough support that we can win on the ballot. It is that kind of threat that forces concessions from the ruling class. Similarly, the New Deal wasn't won by some social democrats at the time like Mamdani-esque figures doing a quote unquote charm offensive on anybody, or FDR doing a charm offensive on the billionaires. No, FDR was capitalism's premier guy. The reason the New Deal was won because of the 1934 general strike in Minneapolis, and being one of the crucial events, but alongside that, there were other watershed victories that completely changed the course of the US labor movement, which is, for example, in the Midwest, the auto workers sit down strikes. All of these completely changed the balance of power for a while, for a short while, between workers and the bosses and their political representatives. And FDR felt forced to pass the New Deal policies because he was clear, and the wiser among the capitalist class were clear, that it is either that or the pitchforks. So it was under the threat of near revolutionary movements, including general strikes, that these victories were achieved. So we have to absolutely refuse to drink the snake oil that Mamdani and AOC and others are peddling, that somehow we can make any substantial improvements in the lives of working class people by depending on these leaders being a cozy with the Democratic Party. I mean, look at what Mamdani has done. I mean, he has refused to fight to tax the rich. He actually, the New York Times themselves reported that he refused to go to the February 25th Tax the Rich rally in Albany, in the state capital, because he did not, and these are the words of the New York Times, he did not want to antagonize Governor Kathy Hochul, who is an arch corporate Democrat. She has flatly refused to tax the rich for years. This is not a new position from her. Uh, she is the rich guy's, governor. She is an arch Zionist, and not only that, she recently helped become a strike breaker against the nurses' strike by passing an executive order and repeatedly renewing it, making it easier for the hospital bosses to hire scab nurses against them. And the hospital bosses ended up spending upwards of $100 million hiring scabs in their attempt to break the railroad, break the nurses' strike. So, and this is the kind of person that Mamdani has endorsed and chosen to make deals with. He has endorsed Hakeem Jeffries, who is an arch Zionist, and like Adam Smith, has voted for tens of billions of dollars for the genocide in Gaza. We cannot make deals or alliances with the warmongering anti-worker billionaire class. We have to build our own strength as the working class. That is why I am running as an independent revolutionary socialist for the US Congress.
And in California, there was a strike of Kaiser workers, nurses, 31,000. Apparently, Kaiser brought in scabs and spent over $1 billion for scabs for replacement workers. The Democrats, not a word. Gavin Newsom and the Democratic Party, the fact that this so-called nonprofit Kaiser is spending $1 billion when they can't provide care, mental health care, nurses, proper care for people, and getting rid of workers using AI, it doesn't seem to be an issue for the Democrats and the trade union bureaucracy, which has not made an issue. They went back to work without a contract. They're part of AFSCME. UNAC is part of AFSCME. There was no national campaign by AFSCME, by the national unions. And this raises the question again. There's a rise of fascism. You have a fascist government. Even Sarah Nelson and others have said it's a fascist government. Yet it's the trade union bureaucracy does not want to mobilize millions of workers. There's a campaign for a general strike against this fascist government, the union busting, the ICE raids, and yet the silence by the trade union bureaucracy. In fact, when Brandon Johnson called for a general strike in Chicago, complete silence. When Sarah Nelson said there should be a general strike, complete silence by the trade union bureaucracy. Do you think the trade union bureaucracy really is terrified of mobilizing the working class for fear that they will lose power and control of the unions?
They are absolutely terrified of that. In fact, they are much of the overwhelming majority of the trade union leadership today in the United States, and this has been a problem for over 50 years. I mean, it spans several lifetimes, where it's like it has been a decimation of the proud militancy of the American labor movement. You know what we were just talking about in terms of the general strikes in the 1930s, the auto workers sit-down strikes. I mean, there's nothing comparable that to today that we have today. In fact, as I said, most of the union leadership is deeply compromised, and they follow ideas of what I would call business unionism. And business unionism basically is a complete antithesis to what we need, which is militancy, or in other words, class struggle unionism. Class struggle unionism is based on the idea of understanding the true nature of capitalism, having a materialist analysis of capitalism and understanding that the interests of the ruling class are diametrically opposed to the needs of the working class, and that is not because we want it, so it is so, so it's a core idea of Marxism and militancy is to just have a material understanding of what the system is. The system is presented in that way. We cannot wish it to be different. It is a class divided system. And so class struggle unionism means understanding that, and then flowing from that logic, understanding that the only way that workers can win anything is by actually building struggle against the ruling class, because of the basic logic that wealth that is produced by billions of workers under capitalism, only a fraction of that wealth is attained by the working class in the form of wages, benefit, all the public assistance and public programs that we have been able to win through our militant action. But the vast majority of the wealth that we produce as workers is seized by the capitalist class. That is in the nature of the capitalist system. And so it is presented as a zero-sum game. So if workers are to win higher wages, for example, then those higher wages are mathematically, arithmetically going to come by taking it away from the profits of the bosses, the billionaires and the multimillionaires. And they're not going to do that willingly. They're not going to give it willingly. So that is why it takes a fight. And so that is the logic of needing to build class struggle, fight back against the ruling class in order to win any victory. Business unionism is a complete negation of all of these realities. It is a mythology that the role of the labor leadership is to mediate between bosses and workers, and that is why you will find business unionist leaders, and in fact most of the language that is used even in magazines like Labor Notes and so on, they'll always talk about the bargaining. They'll say bargaining, we're going to bargaining table this and bargaining table that, which is perpetuating, as I said, a mythology that somehow we can sit across the table from the bosses and then haggle over how much we get. But that doesn't make sense at all. It's a denial of reality, because haggling or bargaining makes sense only if the two sides are roughly at least somewhat equal. And then, you can push each other to get something for yourself. But that is not what the reality is under capitalism. The status quo of capitalism is that workers have no power, capitalists have all the power, and the only way workers can change the balance of power is by getting organized and going on strike and threatening the profits and the wealth of the bosses, which is the whole point of going on strike. And so it is absolutely shameful. I'm not surprised, but it is still stunning and shameful. As you said, that the UNAC, which is part of AFSCME, the leadership of the main union, the United Nurses Association of California, the leadership at the head of the Kaiser Permanente healthcare workers strike, 31,000 workers, nurses, physician assistants, physical therapists, all of these at one of the largest healthcare organizations going on this valiant strike. And then the leadership calling that strike off without even winning a new contract, let alone some gains in that contract. I mean, it is just absolutely stunning. How do you call off a strike without even winning a new contract? And I just wanted to quote, Steve, what the leadership said, what the UNAC leadership said when they called off the strike. They said, this is a quote, "There has been significant movement at the bargaining table. Returning members to their patients and their livelihoods is the clearest path to securing a final agreement and building on the progress achieved during the strike." This is turning reality on its head. You give up all your leverage by ending your strike. The strike is what gives you the leverage in the first place. And so this is how abysmal the situation is in the labor leadership that we have. This is the type of leadership, and they are not unique. This is the type of leadership, unfortunately, that we have on offer in Minneapolis. When we had the massive protests on January 23rd, which were very crucial, but they weren't, as they were built, a general strike. And the reason they weren't is because the union leadership there, including AFSCME and ATU and so on, they actually literally circulated language that reminded the workers of the no strike clauses in their strikes, basically warning them, don't go on strike because, you might get fired with these no strike clauses. And so this is the tragedy that we are stuck in, where the vast majority, it's the no strike clauses have become ubiquitous in contracts in US labor. And that itself is a signifier of how terrible the situation is with the leadership. And on top of that, the logic of accepting no strike clauses is also then refusing to buck the no strike clause and go on strike, because that they could have done that. The Minneapolis leadership could have carried out a general strike regardless of the no strike clauses, like the West Virginia teachers did in 2018. They could have done that, but they chose not to do that because that's the logic of also of accepting no strike clauses.
And of course, they support capitalism. They openly support capitalism and say we have a capitalist state. We have to operate within the capitalist
Yes.
framework, which means no striking, which means union busting. And one of the interesting developments last month, the U.S. Congress and the Trump government actually agreed to fund the National Endowment for Democracy, which gives money to the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO, the Schuller Solidarity Center, providing them with $71 million. So you have to ask, why would the Trump government give $71 million to the AFL-CIO's international operations around the world if it wasn't benefiting U.S. imperialism? And this center, the Solidarity Center, which helped overthrow governments in Venezuela around the world, has received over $1 billion from the U.S. government for its international operations. There's been complete silence by labor notes, all these publications, not a word about the fact that Ned has been refunded by the Trump government and the Republicans, and they're continuing to get paid by the U.S. government for international operations. Isn't this an example of labor imperialism? The AFL-CIO, which says they're fighting the Trump government, the union busting, and then taking 71 million from the U.S. government for international operations?
Oh, absolutely. It is a hallmark of business unionism is exactly what you said, which is making peace with the capitalist systems. Basically the analysis that, well, capitalism is here to stay permanently and you might as well make peace with it. And then when you start along that road, the logic again leads itself to trying to make peace with the bosses. When you make peace with the system, you start to make peace with the bosses because they're the ones with the power. So how else would you survive without making peace with them? And an important corollary of all of this, Steve, is also that the logic of making peace with the capitalist system leads to the logic of making peace with the bosses, which then leads to the logic of making peace with the bosses' political organizations. And therein lies also the other problem, intractable problem that can only be solved by a resurgence of militancy, which is the labor leadership being tied at the hip to the Democratic Party and refusing to break from the Democratic Party no matter what. And that is also a very core explanation of why the labor leadership does not carry out strike actions. And when they do, it's either, somewhat tepid or in the case of Kaiser, just outright defeat, is because strikes end up embarrassing the political organizations of capitalism also, along with the boss. I mean, they embarrass the bosses. They remind workers of their own power against the bosses, and that's why it's embarrassing. But by its very nature, it's also embarrassing to the Democratic and Republican parties, and that is a very important reason why the labor leadership refuses to act any militant way. And I have to say, even Sarah Nelson. I mean, Sarah Nelson in 2017 played a crucial role. No, sorry, not in 2017. 2019 played a crucial role in fighting to end the federal government shutdown by the mere threat of going on strike. When she called for a strike, the threat itself forced the Trump administration to call off the shutdown. But since then, unfortunately, even leaders like her have failed to act. And I believe that is because they have such intrinsic ties to the Democratic Party as well. And so it is a real logjam. I mean, it is a logjam. And all of this is also indicating, in the example you gave of the Listular Center, that is an example of what I would call, and it has been a process, as I said, of 50 years. It's not like it happened today, of NGOization of the labor movement, or NGOification of the labor movement, where the labor leaders see labor unions as little NGOs and NGOs, by definition, they are at peace with the capitalist system, with the bosses. In fact, most NGOs are funded by the bosses' organizations themselves. I mean, obviously there are lots of well-meaning people at NGOs, but the whole NGO, the idea of NGO complex, it's meant to be deflecting away from working class struggle. And so we need to point again away from all of that and towards militant working class struggle. And for that, we need breakthroughs. I mean, that is why, Steve, we are building Workers Strike Back nationally, and we are running this campaign for the US Congress because we have a strong understanding that the way we were able to commandeer the political agenda of Seattle by winning one elected office and organizing, we are not a labor union, but we organized union members and non unionized workers in historic movements to win the highest minimum wage and the Amazon tax and renters' rights. And we forced the labor leadership kicking and screaming to support what we were doing because it was going to be embarrassing to them if they didn't join us because of the mobilization we were doing. And that is the approach you need to overcome what I would call all of these people as gatekeepers. The business unionist labor leadership is a gatekeeper against working class struggle. And so there is no avenue forward for working class struggle to get the kind of breakthroughs we need to win if we don't have a strategy to overcome the gatekeepers and the careerists. And this is ultimately what they are. Gatekeepers are careerists because it's so much easier to have a career. For Liz Schuller, her $350,000 and her hobnobbing with the rich and famous, her lifestyle, that is so protected if she never challenges the bosses. The day she starts challenging the bosses, which I don't think is going to happen, but the day she does that, that's the day she will become enemy number one of the ruling class, and she does not want to do that. If you take the approach that I have taken, you will become enemy number one of the ruling class, but that is part of the job. If you're going to lead working class struggle, you absolutely need to take on that class war back against
And
the ruling class. And that is why, because we need breakthroughs, is why we are running this campaign for the US Congress, because we strongly believe that we have a chance to win, and that if we win, it will be a political earthquake that can actually help catalyze movements nationally and also a path towards a new party for the working class.
And of course, Liz Schuller was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was a pro imperialist agency supporting right wing unions, fascists around the world. They were involved in overthrowing the government in Ukraine in 2014. You had Randy Weingarten going to Kyiv, calling for them to overthrow the government. This
Yes.
is Randy Weingarten, who
Oh,
says she
yeah.
supports the working class and the teachers here, and she's supporting the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. And then helping
I
to
mean, she,
support the war against the Palestinians, supporting the genocide. Now, the other thing, you're going to be coming to California this month. And during these strikes, like the UNAC AFSCME strike, they never raised the issue of single payer. There are other unions, SEIU, NUHW, they're going on strike, yet they don't even talk about the fact there's a supermajority in the legislature in California of the Democrats. They could have an emergency session. They can say, we're going to get rid of these criminal HMO organizations, which are actually literally killing people because they're refusing to provide proper care. They're cutting money for profits for the CEOs, no prosecution of these executives for crimes against the working class, against the patients. And these unions, which go on strike, don't even mention single payer. They don't even
oh,
mention the fact that we should get rid of these HMOs, their executives, and have public money for public health care.
absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up because I mean the Kaiser strike is a great example of all of these problems. Tragically, a great example, which is first of all, just the overall problematic nature of business unionism. Calling off the strike without winning any victories and saying that that gives them
And without a membership vote, they didn't even
without.
tell, they didn't even have a discussion.
Oh yes, absolutely. Thank you for adding that, because I forgot to mention that. Yes, no democratic discussion or vote at all. I mean, this is absolutely just horrendous. It really shows you how that how desperate the situation is inside the labor movement because of the state of the labor leadership and how rotten they are. And yeah, so I mean, overall the business unionist approach was disastrous in the Kaiser strike, and on top of that, it was an example. They're not the only healthcare unions as a whole, as you said, in the United States have made an ongoing mistake. It's a strategic mistake. It's a strategic choice. It's not coincidental. It's a choice they have made to not include, to refuse to include universal public health care as a demand in these strikes. I mean, on the one hand, if healthcare workers strikes included the demand for universal public health care, then it has two impacts. One is that it helps strengthen the struggle for universal public health care, which is an urgent thing we need to win for the working class nationally. But also, on the other hand, including a demand like that actually helps really enhance, it would help really enhance the community solidarity, the working class white community solidarity for the strike, because it is a really, really fantastic, concrete way of showing that the nurses who are on strike are not, and this is the kind of fear mongering and vilifying of nurses strikes that is done, that oh my god, when nurses go on strike, it is endangering the patients, and so you should not support nurses strike because they are against patients. But in fact, if you in fact, obviously we know that is not true. Nurses are extremely self-sacrificing and really dedicated to their jobs of saving lives and to their patients. But it's not only that. If the demand for universal public health care is included as a strike demand, then actually it's a concrete way of showing to the workers, to on the whole, working class as a whole, that really the people who are to blame for the unnecessary lives that are lost and the misery that is caused to patients is by these HMOs, by the billionaire class, which is profiting from the absolutely broken healthcare situation. I should also mention here, Steve, that it is really, really terrible that the California Nurses Association has chosen to endorse billionaire Tom Steyer for governor.
Another billionaire. We need more billionaires. This is the solution.
Exactly. After they got burned by Gavin Newsom, now they have endorsed another corporate Democrat and a billionaire.
And he wants to break up PG&E. He doesn't want public control of the energy utilities. Let's break it up and make it smaller. This is the capitalist program of
Yeah,
Tom Steyer, and the CNA NNU is endorsing a billionaire as if we need more billionaires to have a solution to the economic crisis of capitalism in California.
exactly, exactly. I mean, this is a completely disastrous strategy. It is a dead end, another dead end. I mean, CalCare, California Healthcare, which, granted, the CNA leadership has actually played a real role in putting forward CalCare, but twice their strategy of tying the movement for CalCare to the Democratic Party has failed miserably two times. So they are now getting ready to do it, three strikes, where they're going to lose by that strategy. And that is why I'm going to be speaking at this CalCare rally at the state capitol in Sacramento on March 20th. And my message is going to be that that is a dead end strategy. And the only way we can win universal public health care is by working class people and union members building independent fighting movements. And part of my campaign program for Congress is to fight for free health care for all, funded by taxing the rich, which is a very important component. We have to mention taxing the rich, Steve, because we saw what happened in Vermont. In Vermont, the Democratic Party was under enough pressure from working class people that they were forced to, in name, pass universal health care, but it was an unfunded mandate, and it sat there gathering dust for 3 years. And then 3 years after that, the Democrats said, "Oh gosh, we don't know how to fund it. We're going to repeal it." And that is why it is important that we are calling for free healthcare for all, funded by taxing the rich. That means free healthcare for everybody, regardless of your citizenship status, regardless of your gender identity, regardless of your ethnicity. And and the idea is to have free healthcare of every kind, whether it is dental, vision, mental health care, every healthcare. It can be funded, and the way it can be funded is go to where all the trillions of dollars are, and that is with the rich.
Well, one of the things that happened during this strike is that the other unions, UHW, SEIU, UHW, and the nurses in Oakland were crossing the picket lines. So here was a chance to have a united front to go out together and say, we want single payer, get these HMOs out. They didn't raise single payer, and they don't see the fight for single payer as a mobilization of the working class and the users of Kaiser, the patients of Kaiser, coming together to fight the government, to fight the Democrats. And I think that has to do with the fact they're in bed with the Democrats and they're supporting another billionaire Democrat to solve the problems in California. And the other thing that I think has to be raised is the teacher strikes, because there have been teacher strikes throughout California. We Can't Wait campaign. of the CTA and the CFT, California Federation of Teachers, and they have had so-called strike victories in San Francisco, but then they announced they're going to be having layoffs of teachers at the same time in Oakland and other cities. In Los Angeles, there's a major struggle now, and there's no demand that the capitalists in California pay for healthcare. I mean, pay for education. I mean, this was a strike. This was an issue in the San Francisco teacher strike to get healthcare. They don't even have healthcare for dependents. So they said, "Oh, we negotiated. We're going to get healthcare for dependents on July 1st, and then next year we'll have healthcare for all workers who are employed by the school district." But then, why shouldn't you have single payer? How can they solve it just locally? And why should you be taking money from education to provide healthcare, which is going to the insurance companies? It's not going to workers. But this was never made an issue during the strike. None of the strikes of teachers raised the issue of single payer for all, get it off the table so we don't have to negotiate about health care. And that's a major issue in education. So you have these strikes which are happening, this so-called We Can't Wait campaign. They're not all together. They have them divided up. They're striking separately, and then they go back to work with supposedly a victory. And they announce the same week or even before that there are going to be layoffs after the strike takes place. So what kind of program, what kind of agenda is that?
It is a disastrous strategy, and I mean, there's several things that you said. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but one of the things you mentioned, which I think needs to be drawn out also, is just the very fundamental problems with the labor leadership. I mean, the idea of crossing the picket line of another union. I mean, if there's a basic understanding of capitalism, a basic understanding of the union movement, you forgive my language, but you don't fucking cross the picket line. You never fucking cross the picket line. You stand with your fellow workers, and it doesn't fucking matter which union they're in. And so this is what I mean. This is the abysmal state that the labor leadership, the labor movement is in because of the rotten labor leadership, and it is a huge sense of urgency for us to turn this situation around. But I think in terms of the strategy of what needs to be done, is it can't be done by individual rank and file members who are watching this and feel inspired and then they want to build militancy. It doesn't work by just one or two. It has to be a major upheaval, and we need nothing short of a reckoning in the labor movement. We need to sweep aside this rotten labor leadership, and that can only happen through massive breakthrough victories that need to be achieved either through major mass movements leading to general strikes. Again, but it's not going to come out of nowhere. It has to have leadership. The BLM movement, for example, was the largest street protest movement in US history in 2020, and yet the victories won by the movement are so are minimal, compared to the strength of the street movement. And the reason is that the vast majority of the BLM leadership ended up selling out the movement. They became what I would call misleaders, or in other words, gatekeepers. And in fact,
And they got money from nonprofits.
yes, they did. They did. That is that. It's the NGOization of mass movements, and that is. And in fact, what's striking, Steve, is that the Amazon tax that we won, which we won, during the BLM movement, and with strong support from the movement, became one of the, and perhaps the most crucial, single most substantial victory. And that's because myself and my fellow revolutionary socialists refused to accept the gatekeeping of the BLM misleaders. And that's a strategy we need. That is why I keep emphasizing that our congressional campaign is not about electing me for my career. Absolutely not. I have always taken the average worker's wage, and our elections, the approach that we used for our office was to build militant struggle that is not possible at this moment given the entrenched role that the labor leadership is playing. And that is why I would urge everybody who is watching this, listening to this, to see our campaign for Congress as the kind of breakthrough launching pad we need in order to begin the process of that reckoning that we need inside the labor movement, including sweeping aside the current leaders who are going to, who have led us down this disastrous path and will continue to do so.
And you're also going to be speaking in other places. In Northern California, there's a tour. You're going to be speaking in San Francisco on March the 21st in the evening at 518 Valencia. And you have a plan to reach out to workers in California to give them a perspective of the fight, not only for single payer, but also for a workers' party against continued support for the Democrats. And this question of a workers' party, it seems more and more, it's a political question for the working class.
It very much, it's a pivotal question, and the rebuilding the militancy in the labor movement, and building this reckoning, as I'm saying, and that goes hand in hand with building a new mass party for the working class. You can't do one without the other. That is absolutely fundamental to the process. And yes, that is another reason why we are fighting so hard for our campaign. The primary election is on the first Tuesday of August. It is a top two primary. We have a real shot at getting into the general election, but we can't do that without mass support from working class people nationally, which we already have, but it needs to continue to grow. We have raised over $450,000 in this campaign through working class donations. The average donation is $25. And we have donations from working people from every state in the nation and also from Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. And so you're right. I'm going to be there personally. I'm going to be speaking alongside you, Steve, at the rally in San Francisco, and also will be speaking at rallies in several other cities like San Jose and Mount Diablo. So I really urge people who are in the Bay Area, working people, union members, please join our rallies there. I know we'll have flyers and announcements out about the specific cities and dates and times, but also join us on March 20th at the rally in Sacramento. That's Friday, March 20th for CalCare, because we really need to build that movement. And I would really urge everybody to also go to kshamasawant.org, our campaign website. Please make donations and please get involved. And no matter where you live, there is a way for you to get involved.
And last point, I saw Adam Smith on Fox TV talking with Fox TV, very friendly interview that he had on the fascist network about Iran. And why don't you talk about why Fox is giving him such credence as a legitimate spokesperson for the opposition? Here's the Democrat, Adam Smith, on Fox TV.
Yes, Fox News being the channel of the warmongering billionaires. I mean, overtly, they're all for warmongering billionaires. They're all pro-capitalist newspapers, including the New York Times. But obviously, Fox News is just overtly and extremely reactionary and right wing and very pro Trump. Well, they love Adam Smith because Adam Smith, as I said, is a general among the among the warmongering Democrats. He is basically a Republican. In fact, I saw him do an interview with a local reactionary channel here in Seattle after the election in November 2024. And his contention in that interview was that the Democrats were too left. That is why they lost. That was his analysis. The Democrats, that Harris was too left leaning, and that's why she lost. Which is actually, complete 180-degree opposite of the truth. As they are, the Democratic Party's own internal autopsy, which was leaked recently, that it shows that actually Harris lost because she was refusing to say that she would end the genocide, or at least do something to end the
He was
genocide.
supporting the
He
genocide.
was supporting. Yeah, that's my point. That she lost precisely because of being a warmongering candidate. And here was Adam Smith in November or December of 2024 telling this reactionary channel here. It's like I think it's a program on the local Fox News channel that the Democrats lost because they were too left leaning. And the reason I'm sharing that is because I was looking at the comments on that. There was a Facebook post about that show episode, and I was looking at the comments, and most of the comments were from reactionary Republicans, just ordinary people who share those politics. But one of them stood out to me because that person said, wow, this guy sounds more Republican than Republicans. So I think that sums it up about Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the guy for the warmongering billionaire class. He is the guy for companies like Humana, who are dead set against any kind of universal public health care, the profiteering health insurance billionaires and multimillionaires. He is one of the five remaining Democrats in the House who voted for the Iraq war. He has voted for tens of billions of dollars for the genocide in Gaza. He voted repeatedly to ban United Nations food assistance to Gaza, to the Palestinian people, at a time when there were reports of catastrophic levels of mass starvation. This is the kind of guy he is. He has the blood of over a million Iraqis on his hands. He has the blood of the over 500,000 Palestinians who have been killed on his hands. He deserves to be on trial for war crimes. The least he deserves is to be thrown out of office. I mean, he even went so far as to uh, publicly call anti-war, anti-genocide activists like you and me, Steve. He called us left-wing fascists and demanded that we anti-war activists be arrested. He voted to create ICE. He has voted repeatedly to fund ICE. He voted to break the railroad worker strike. This guy is thoroughly backed by the Zionist lobby. AIPAC was his biggest funder in the 2024 election. And last but not least, it needs to be clear to working people that the Democratic Party is not going to just stand aside and allow our campaign to just cruise ahead. They're going to carry out all kinds of machinations. In 2019, when I was running for my second re-election, at that time, the Democratic Party ran a slew of candidates against me. I mean, we were losing count of the number of candidates that they were running against me in order to deflect vote away from my campaign. And they didn't win. And Amazon dropped $1.5 million against me that year, and they still didn't win. But the point being that they are not just going to stand aside and let us cruise ahead. They are going to carry out all kinds of steps. And one of the steps that they might possibly take is to run a quote unquote progressive Democrat in the race and say to people that, oh, if you are against the genocide and you want to shut down ICE, then and if you find Adam Smith unpalatable, then here's a progressive Democrat. Vote for them. Working people have to be very clear that voting for progressive Democrats is not the solution. Look at what Pramila Jayapal and AOC have done. For example, Pramila Jayapal is a quote unquote progressive Democrat here in Washington state, and people know AOC, of course. They both have voted for the Iron Dome, which is part of the genocidal apparatus of the Israeli state. They both voted to break the railroad workers' strike. They have refused to ever bring any bill like universal health care, like $15 an hour. And under their watch, the Congressional Progressive Caucus is more than 100 people. They've even included Adam Smith in that. I mean, that is how ridiculous this Congressional Progressive Caucus
Adam
is.
Smith is part of the Progressive Caucus.
Yes. I mean, so that should tell you enough about this, how progressive that caucus is. But regardless, even if you look at these, seemingly more progressive, and I say seemingly because that is not what they actually do. They don't carry out any progress. The national minimum wage, as you know, Steve, is still disgraceful $7.25, and a tipped minimum wage nationally is $2.13. And this is under the watch of these so-called progressive Democrats like Pramila Jayapal and AOC. We don't have anything close to universal health care, and not even a strong public option. They didn't even, when they had the majority in the House and the Senate under Biden, they did not even make the ACA enhanced subsidies permanent. They have done nothing for the working class, but instead, as I said, they broke the railroad worker strike and they presided over the genocide in Gaza. And so voting for progressive Democrats is a dead end. Voting for Adam Smith is a dead end, meaning it is more war, more genocide, more attacks on the working class. And if we want a sea change away from what we have seen so far, which I know the vast majority of the American working class wants. I mean, you have all these young people clamoring for a fight back. Actually, the consciousness of the US working class is like dry kindling. People want a fight back. How is that fight back going to happen without clear leadership? That is what we have on offer. That is why this campaign is so crucial.
I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Kshama Sawant. She is a candidate for Congress against warmonger Adam Smith. in Washington, and she's going to be speaking in California this month and attending a rally for single payer in Sacramento on March the 20th. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Steve. Solidarity.